there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today will be the start of my series on Christopher Columbus. Today we will be going over the early parts of his life and career. Christopher Columbus, born Cristoforo Colombo to a weaver named Domenico in Guano. Not much is known about his origins, which was of Columbus's own choice, as he preferred to be talked about based on his merits rather than his ancestry. He was very close to his brothers Bartholomew and Giacomo, whom were good help of his throughout his life. Columbus lacked formal schooling and was open about that, which, like other people of his time, meant he had to learn from experience, which also meant he, as typical people, didn't read books which didn't fit his already preconceived theories. In his day, the best ways to move up the social ladder was from either getting a job within the church or getting into the warring business. While a religious man, it wasn't until he was older that he became much more devout and embraced a more soldier-like attitude, where he firstly and arguably more importantly wanted to convert natives to Christianity. He also wanted to conquer the warlike people. He became more religious from his trials of adversity and became more soldier-like due to his political insecurities. It must be remembered, though, the Native Americans largely lost their lives due to diseases. Columbus's ideas for funding the crusade were treated as a joke by many people in his day, and Columbus, while ambitious, had a fear of failure. Typical of men in his day, he was anti-Semitic and condemned Jews as reprobate, but he did believe the Holy Spirit could work through them. He had a sense of divine purpose, but was riddled in doubts a lot of time when he came to the task at hand, but he sought to convert masses to Christianity as God's messenger. His mental prowess came in bursts throughout his life. He was a very cocky man, you can say, about his own abilities, and could be a bit of a religious drama queen with a persecution complex. Columbus is thought best to be understood in his context, i.e. late 15th century Genoese world under a monarchy. Columbus didn't appear to ever have a strong want to take the war route to success, as well as his only really military experience growing up was being an independent commander at sea between Angevin and Aragonese conflicts. He would thus take the role as an explorer from his inspiration by the culture the chivalric literature of his day created. In his time, many discoveries were being made, which each one bringing more curiosity than the last, which you can say was also an inspiration for him, as he loved the idea of challenging the wisdom of his day. Columbus's career is documented in the records of his 5 voyages, 4 of which are from a letter he wrote in 1495 to convince the Spanish monarchy of his skills, in which the first was his Tunis trip so he could capture an Aragonese ship at a Tunis harbor. Columbus, being the man he was, likely did exaggerate a lot of things he did so he could make himself look better, as that was his personality. He would begin traveling around the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, telling about the Genoese life with colonization all the way. He would marry a noblewoman named Donna Felipe around 1478. She had loose but important enough connections to the Portuguese monarchy, which meant a lot to Columbus. She'd give him his son Diego before dying. Columbus would travel to the Portuguese trading post of São Jorge de Mana, which was known for its gold. It would likely join the Bristolian venture to Iceland. All his travels validated him as a man who had sailed nearly every sea traversed at the day and held tight to Pope Pius II's arguments in favor of being able to navigate all oceans. Now, Columbus, as you can figure, wasn't perfect, as he had a sort of persecution complex and seen himself as a friendless outsider whom people didn't want to accept, which is lunacy given his connections. He didn't start out with a unique vision, but a simple hunger for discovery, which was perfectly common for his day. A good thing about Columbus, however, is that he had a very empirical epistemology. He combined his experience and his knowledge of cosmology from books to his craft. He modified his theories after he experienced the New World, and his Atlantic project was informed by those tools. From 1480s onward on his career, he would use books to confirm his experiences with works like Ptolemy, Marinus of Tyre, and Albert Magnus being some of the authors that he took inspiration from. When you look at cosmographers and explorers of the 15th century, His scheme of crossing the Atlantic Ocean was predictable. In his time, map makers would put speculative lands in blank spots on their maps so more discoveries could be made, which took a while before the map could be updated. Columbus showed the limits of the Atlantic from his work, which previous had seemed boundless. There were two main theories in Columbus's day, one being that the Atlantic was narrow and the other that such a thing as the antipodes existed. This ultimately explains why Columbus thought the Atlantic was smaller than it was, as the theories were trying to figure out the size of the Earth, which since ancient times had been underestimated. Columbus was inspired by Pierre de Ali's idea that the antipodes were a large landmass, which Columbus inferred a narrow Atlantic from, which he got a lot of his calculations from. He was aware of views of the cosmographer Paleo Toscanelli and thought the Atlantic was a bit large, so he underestimated it. Columbus was obviously mistaken and had made errors, such as he didn't standardize the estimates of Ali. So the ideas of a narrow Atlantic that led to his mistakes were borrowed from Toscanelli and Ali, along with some of the work from the book of Marco Polo. It's thought Columbus had many ideas of where he was going to end up, with Asia, the antipodes, and undiscovered islands being the main ones, as he had embraced exploration for the sake of advancing his social status. A voyage anywhere would do. By the 1480s, he became a geographer and a navigator whom could make good arguments from written authorities for voyages. Columbus made maps in accordance with how Ptolemy did so, while also thinking of himself as great when he thought he had proved that he knew something Ptolemy didn't know. Columbus liked exotic lands and the riches that came from them, which is what attracted him about Asia, along with, of course, the idea that he wanted to discover something no matter where he went. By 1492, what he mainly focused on was finding a short route to the east. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we'll be going over Columbus's efforts to find a patron in order so he could go on the Atlantic crossing. Columbus would look for a patron to fund his trip. In the 15th century, explorers had to have support from the crown to go out, as an explorer couldn't reign sovereign over land and couldn't protect gains made without the crown protecting them from harm. This was made clear when Columbus more or less said so in the late 1490s, when he was accused of trying to hoard his findings from the crown. Columbus, in typical fashion, would exaggerate his acquiring of protection from the crown, saying that he fended off rivals from Portuguese, English, French, whom all were begging for his service. In reality, Columbus didn't get much support anywhere and only got the sponsorship after a continuing effort. He was turned down in Portugal due to being unable to come to a fair deal. King Fernandez took a chance on him, as Castile at the time wasn't known for their promoting of Atlantic discovery. He approved of it because he hoped to get gold from it after losing money from a war with Portugal with other costs. In 1479, when King Ferdinand and Isabella joined and united the crowns of Aragon and Castile, it was becoming clear that Islam's growing expansion was becoming a problem as it gained a footing in Spain and its conflict with Moors and Turks. King Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to be king and queen of Jerusalem, as they had, in their mind, inherited it. Columbus, being the religious man he was, promised that the profits he gained from his discoveries should go towards a crusade, and found that he had a religious duty to help the king and queen. This shows Columbus didn't set sail solely, contrary to popular opinions, to make himself wealthy or to increase his nobility, even though those were significant motivations, but they were to continue Europe's Asia voyages, to fund a crusade, to help his fellow Christians out and to spread the Gospels. Columbus could on occasion be politically smart because he knew Spain and Portugal were competing with each other intensely at this period, so they'd be more likely to accept him for commercial gain and control over land. During his time in Castile, he developed an intimate relationship with Beatriz Enriquez and had a son named Fernando in November of 1488, although he didn't marry her due to her lower class association. Despite that, he for all purposes made sure she was taken care of and was affectionate towards her. An interesting thing of note with Columbus was that he didn't seem to all be that interested in sex. He disliked the general promiscuity of his men with the natives and their concubinage relationship. Columbus may have had an involvement with Beatriz de Bobadilla, but it's speculative as the story of their affair is Michel de Conio of Savona, who only mentions it offhand. It is thought that when Columbus went to court hearing for his Atlantic project in 1487, the Castile experts believed the earth was flat, but this is absurd, as all learned men at the time knew the earth was round. They weren't for his trip as they believed it was to involve the Antipodes, and that Portuguese searches revealed no new land in the Western Ocean. Columbus took the rejection under his persecution complex and cast himself as a rejected outcast who had to fight against multiple fronts, even though it was more important for political and financial backing than the experts' consent. Columbus gained quite a following leading up to 1492 from political authorities and financial investors. The fact there was heavy competition and there was an urgent need for new gold sources also helped Columbus's cause. He had good friends in the king and queen as well, who respected his conviction and persistence. By January of 1492, the financing for his project was done, with Columbus making a wage of 140,000 maravedis. During that time, the objectives of the trip were narrowed to just the short trip to Asia, as even if the Antipodes existed, it wasn't ensured to be profitable if found. Columbus narrowed his plans for the monarchs and made sure to tell them of his search for Asia. To move on to a character that will be of much importance in this series is Bartholomew de la Casa, a noble Spanish priest of his days. He started not thinking much about the cruelty that fell upon Native American people, but after hearing of the corruption of the colonists and the torment Indians got from a Dominican preacher, he dedicated his life to preaching against the mistreatment of Native Americans. How does Columbus relate to this? Easy. Casa is a great source on the life of Columbus and is, in fact, the reason Columbus's tales of his voyage survived. Casa told how Columbus used his trips to spread the Gospels to everyone, and how the harsh treatment of natives didn't originate with him. Casa also mentions some problems with Columbus, such as he was rather indifferent to slavery and was rather uneducated. At the time of Columbus, Spain had been taken under Erasmian humanism, which was very Pauline-based and stressed how all people are God's people, which meant slaves needed to have civil rights. Columbus, like many men of his time, didn't think anything about the morality of slavery, and likely if he did, he probably would have just said, well, they enslave each other, so why can't we as well while converting them? Columbus had at one point captured 500 Indians after a brief war, but they weren't slaves but rather war captives, and they were released soon after. He has used dogs in a war to match the brutality of the natives there. If one must fault Columbus for bad Native American treatment, people should target his politics with them instead, as due to the fact that Columbus was an explorer at heart and not a politician, he made many stupid calls. Columbus's greatest faults came from his politics, as he'd make a series of stupid decisions which in the end would cause harm to the Indians. One such example was making Alonso de Ojeda the leader of the group. Alonso would go on to abuse Indians by doing things like cutting off their ears, even though Columbus had told him beforehand not to hurt them. The food and wine from Spain would run out in Columbus's colonies while he was away, and the man began torturing natives so to find gold and supplies. The notion of pre-Columbian America as a paradise full of tree-hugging hippies is absurd, as slavery was a prominent part of the culture of Indians before Columbus got there. Columbus was a discoverer who claimed new lands and can't be wholly blamed for the Spanish colonial enterprise that devastated so many Native Americans, most of which came from the diseases that were inflicted on them. There was plenty of infighting going on amongst native tribes, and many times in history, Spaniards were greeted with violence from Arawaks. An Indian chief of northeast Haiti wanted Columbus to establish a base to protect him from his enemies on the islands. Sacaros, a branch of the Tainos, had adopted their weapons against the Puerto Rican Caribs. Now, this isn't to say that atrocities didn't happen to the Native Americans. They most certainly did, but much, if not all, of these atrocities happened long after Columbus's death, and to blame him for said atrocities is like praising him for the fact Spanish Christians would end the human sacrificing practices that the Aztecs did. The initial relations between Europeans and Indians during the early part of Columbus's discovery was an up and down relationship. Casa also talks of the more mundane purpose of Columbus's first voyage, which was to go to the lands of India and meeting the Prince Great Khan, while also mentioning the deeper level where it was to spread the gospel throughout the lands, while establishing more feudal power so he could be given a noble status from the monarchy. His role originally gave him all the judging rights as an admiral of Castile. He'd be nominated to the subordinate officer role, which he didn't appear to like, along with becoming a governor and viceroy, which gave him similar jurisdiction but could command obedience by monarchs. He was investigated twice for what the monarchs called bad conduct. Columbus had little control of Hispaniola due to Spaniards not liking him because he was Genoese, but still helped stop some abuses such as telling his people to treat Indians with kindness and preventing his crew members from eating Indians when food was short on the ship. This can be explained by the fact that Columbus was given a huge task, i.e. head an underdeveloped and terrible colony with opponents more than eager to ruin his image to the monarchs who felt they were too generous in their contract with him, which restricted what Columbus could do in his role. But this is not to say, however, Columbus wasn't in the wrong at times, as he did run away from his responsibilities a lot to explore. This all resulted in Columbus's powers being restricted, and essentially the monarchy centralized the project, which resulted in bad results for the colony. On a brighter note, Columbus was the only person in the 15th century to further Atlantic exploration, because Columbus had judged his course in a good direction and foreshadowed the standardized optimum gallon route which lasted the whole time of the age of sailing. He had to make a more effective route to the Canaries so he could guarantee the success of his mission, and because once he set sail from the Castilian port he'd have to go to the Canaries as it was the only possession they owned in the Atlantic. Columbus used a chart, star observations, and a compass to guide him on his trip. Columbus's chart was based on a small world theory with the existence of the often mythical Antilla and Kingu lands. It was said by Casa to be a Toscanelli map, which due to its obliviousness to distances, helped Columbus legitimize his already belief in the small world theory. The mutiny was alleged to be on many of Columbus's men's minds, as they supposedly believed Columbus would die and take everyone with him in the effort to become a great lord. This, however, could just be a product of Columbus's mind, but was strong enough to make Columbus change course. Columbus took time by hours of sunlight and reading latitudes off a Parare de Ali Imago Mundi table, which he did so rigorously so to chart his discoveries to the monarchs. His religiosity grew more and more as he traveled, and especially so once he eventually landed and claimed the bounty for himself. The first landfall, which Columbus called San Salvador, was likely any of the islands of Bahamas, Caicos, or Turks. What he first noticed about the island is the natives whom he called his people needing the gospel preached to them. Columbus wanted to bring them to Christ, give them what he perceived to be the benefits of Latin society and a working class. That wouldn't be the only native people he saw, as he met with Locatas and Tainos of Hispaniola. Since they looked normal, Columbus applied his Aristotelian psychology to conclude they were rational human beings, who thus needed to be preached to. Due to Columbus's line of tradition from humanist and Franciscan writers, he was eager to call the natives good and uncorrupt, but it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. He wanted to exploit them for labor as well, as many were ignorant of warfare and seen them as similar to beasts as well. Columbus was conflicted about his depictions of the native people. He never claimed in his initial impressions of the New World that he was in Asia. He found 3 small islands which he called Santa Maria de la Concepcion, Fernandez, and Isabelle, obviously to honor Jesus and the monarchies. He recorded a general progression of behaviors in natives he met, and gold was recorded to him on October 17th. For about 3 months this sort of thing continued, where he met natives and named islands. Columbus thought he had met the people of Genghis Khan. When he landed in Cuba, he thought he had landed in the island of Cipango, and while he ditched that idea and thought it was part of the mainland of Cathay, initially skeptical of the land, he thought it was beautiful and that it should be loved and that it had much to offer. He became less interested in exploiting the natives to work, but focused more on preaching the Gospels to them. Cuba would become poor in pickings, and by around the end of November, he set sail and wind blew him to a land he called Hispaniola, which would become his most important find. Hispaniola had a fair amount of gold, which paid back Columbus's mission, and he was able to make friends with many of the natives. He thought the environment was great and the people smarter than others he had found. The chief there, in fact, thought Columbus and his people were from a mystical realm, even though Columbus corrected him on that. Columbus took advantage of it and sought to get some supplies from the island. This would, however, foreshadow why it became so easy for Spaniards to abuse the natives. When Columbus's boat, the Santa Maria, went aground, he attributed it to the betrayal by his crew, but that overall that it was a blessing in disguise and that it served a great cosmic purpose, like that of Judas's betrayal of Jesus. He used some of the wood to build a fort there. Columbus was known for not being particularly good at working with others and often lied to people about things, like where gold was, but overall in terms of wealth, the Hispaniola trip was pretty good. Hispaniola natives, however, weren't as peaceful as Columbus recorded, although seeing how exaggeration was common for explorers wanting to commercialize land, and the fact that Columbus really couldn't have known how violent they were, given this time there, his mistakes were understandable. He got back to Spain with his mind thoroughly changed, and with him now less skeptic of monsters on lands given his experience with cannibals, whom he had assumed beforehand to be just travel stories. Columbus became more religious than before with his trip to the New World, with everything he has seen there. He felt fragile and needed comfort, which is what got him to be pious. He didn't have to worry about his rival Martin Pinzon trying to take credit for the voyage and getting some of Columbus's money, as Martin had died. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we will be discussing Columbus's second and third crossing. People often say Columbus discovered America, but even Columbus thought he initially discovered Asiatic lands, while also being fine saying it was unknown lands as well. Despite much pressuring from others, he always insisted that he found a western passage to Asia. Many of his opponents said that Columbus just went to known islands, or that he found antipode islands. Columbus had a good following of people who accepted his claims, with the Duke of Ferrara attributing Columbus's success to Toscanelli's theories. King Ferdinand and Isabella were impressed by the gold supply that Columbus found and supported more explorations from him. They followed they allowed Columbus to sit alongside them, and he basically got hero worship for his travel. The new responsibilities that came with his roles resulted from the hero's worship really didn't do well for him. He, however, had his idea for making a line running from north to south of the Azores accepted. Columbus believed the weather to be much better. Isabella was anxious for a chart to be made that established where a line of demarcation fell, and Columbus had promised her he would make a grid map of his route, but he could not nor ever could, as to do so required technical innovation that he didn't have. The second journey of Columbus was more ambitious and bigger than the first, as it was to explore and colonize the Indies. His governance of the Indies would foreshadow much evils like his other colonizing efforts would. The monarchy went all out with supplies and crew for Columbus's trip. In the first landfall to Dominica, Columbus had found the shortest route access across the Atlantic and was following Indian directions to the southeast of the supposedly rich island of Hispaniola. He went straight through the heart of cannibal country with the Caribs, who tortured and ate male war captives while also sexually exploiting the women. Columbus very much was dismayed by this, and it was largely thought the Caribs deserved enslavement for their crimes against natural law. A friend of Columbus in Hispaniola named Gacanargua was injured in battle to a rival chief, and he learned that 39 Christians at Navidad were killed. Columbus was unsure whether to believe that the Caribs were behind it, or that Gacanargua's story about the Christians being killed by a rival tribe due to their atrocities of the land was true. Columbus, like many servants of the Spanish crown, were okay with some of the Indian chiefs and their politics, although they found their ways not to be as good as Christian states. Columbus recognized the truth in the story of the chief. Columbus himself even had to deal with his own men behaving badly, who were snatching women and stealing gold. He issued Gacanargia a more or less apology gift in the form of knives, tin bells, glass beads, etc., which the chief enjoyed and believed himself to be rich from. This restored good relations between the two people. He had to work with a lot of hardships, such as there not being as much good land to colonize as expected, and livestock not being able to adapt being some of the issues that they face. The town of Isabella, which was founded in January of 1494, had the worst of luck. He issued Margaret in Riverside Forest so as to get more gold, which he got native workers for. Columbus had Alonso de Hajeta roam the land for minerals and people involved with the massacre of Christians. Alonso and his men abused the native people, giving capital punishment to a local chief in the process. It was unknown to Columbus how to treat the natives, as they weren't massively converting, not working, and were behaving badly, which isn't what was expected of them when he had first seen them. Enslavement and deportation were seen as just the things to do in the political environment he was in. Although Columbus had violated many policies in his treatment of the Indians, as it made the Indians less likely to convert and become good workers. While he still had hope for Hispaniola, he had to admit he was wrong on several accounts, with the prediction of gold and Indian behaviors being the top of the list. He wanted the Indians to be made servants of the crown and for the land to be brought up to the European standard of living. A war would break out against the natives after Columbus left Isabella near the end of April in 1494. Columbus deemed this period the most stressful part of his life. Only thoughts of helping fellow Christians in the crusade could ease his mind. King Fernandez and Isabella were against the enslavement of the Indians, like how Columbus did, as they said it wouldn't win them over to Christ with love, and it wouldn't necessarily make them good subjects to them. Indians that Columbus unlawfully enslaved were freed and sent home. Columbus had appeared to fail in his admiral job due to the disease and unlawful slavery that was done. His policy of tribute and punitive action against the Indians ensured they'd endure harsh work. The campaigns Columbus went on in 1494 did great harm to the Indians, although much of the violence done against the natives wasn't Columbus's fault, at least not directly. Many of his policies, while stupid and harmful, powerful weren't intended to do everlasting damage to the natives. The Indians' use of scorched earth policy, along with Columbus's corrupt subordinates, is what made many of the problems. Columbus temporarily stopped some of the bloodsheds with his Spanish fort of the Concepcion de la Vega, which got peace and money from some chiefs. However, this wouldn't last long, as the following year Bartholomew Colon did another bloody campaign. Ferdinand and Isabella issued a judicial inquiry into Columbus in 1495 with the discharge of his offices. Everything had went relatively well, and he was able to restore some peace to the colony. After his judicial inquiry, Columbus's reputation took a hit, with many critics questioning whether he deserved the goods he got from the monarchs. This was a stressful time, as Columbus had worked hard to get what he had. The monarchs would allow Columbus to go on his third voyage in 1498. It was the third voyage and the aftermath of it that really got him hooked into prophecies, as apparently found in the Bible, that were, according to Columbus, telling him of all the massive exploration plans he had planned. Messianic delusions would become fairly common with Columbus. The voyage itself would be extended into Hispaniola colonization and increase Indies exploration, with the monarchy making clear their favor was contingent on his success. Columbus would take his time to get the supplies ready for his voyage and would go to the Franciscan house of La Majorda in order to write proposals for a crusade against Muslims in Mecca. This would allow him to read and improve his skills for the journey. He still would heavily rely on D. Ali and his own personal experiences to guide him on his travels, as he preferred experience over book learning, along with he still preferred being an explorer over administrator. He'd expand upon Pari Daly's protuberance, i.e. earth nipple on the top of the earth idea, and say Eden was there. While this idea was clearly mistaken, it did have the plus side of challenging the then also prevailing idea that the earth was perfectly spherical. Columbus continued to want to evangelize the New World and to leave wealth to his heirs, which would come from his status. Hispaniola would still have much of the same problems it had before Columbus had left it, with the Indians and mosquitoes being troublemakers. Once he'd get there, he would go more south than before so as to find more riches and to test a theory of continent existing in that direction. It was his looking for it that showed Columbus that he wanted to find a new continent, which was what America would turn out to be. Columbus would stop by the Cape Verde Islands, which were mostly deserted, with really only the sick staying there, having been ravaged by disease and attack from the natives. Columbus worried the natives of Hispaniola would become bad like that, and his encounter with immense heat in the doldrums didn't lessen his worries, but he would manage to get away from it and save the voyage. His eye problems that emerged from Cuba years earlier, along with other problems, would come into his visit. The New World would await his arrival. Because he had changed course, he had focused on islands rather than the new continent that he had originally been thinking about. He stumbled upon America and believed he must have been in a new land, and because of its terrain and revamped his interest in the idea he was in the Orient, along with made him think he was on a huge mainland. He believed no matter how near it was to Asia, the land must be distinct from it. When in Hispaniola, he'd tell the monarchs that he found the southern continent talked about. He turned what was before just speculations into scientific facts by finding the mainland, and showed the New World had an unknown continent. Nearly all biographers recognized Columbus as the discoverer of America. Later on, though, his theories that he entertained made him denounce his claim of having found an unknown continent. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we will be discussing the harsh time that Columbus went through during his time in Hispaniola and his last crossing. Columbus was a relative failure as a colonist based on the fact that during his 6 to 7 years governing Hispaniola, the objectives were all unachieved, and Hispaniola was suffering. This could partially be attributed to Columbus's incompetence and partially just due to the environment. The environment he was left in charge of didn't leave a lot of choices for him. Columbus had many problems with his men as he wanted the men to be committed to Hispaniola like he was and believed that Hispaniola had a lot of potentials. Unfortunately, Columbus found himself to be a party of one in that regard, as it was clear most of the men he brought to the New World didn't have the same goals and hold to the same principles as he did. He had exaggerated the beauty of Hispaniola and didn't tell the people just how hostile the land was. Columbus's Genesese trading establishment model that he colonized on was only good if Hispaniola was to be treated as a less than permanent stay, which it wasn't, which led to massive problems such as it was expected the colony would deal in low-range exchange of high-value products. Having many laborers wouldn't be required as Indians were sufficient enough in numbers and adaptability to do the work. Things didn't go as planned though. The monarchy wanted a more agrarian society that socialized the people more and wanted sugar production to be revamped. The land would be divided amongst the colonists. The monarchy wanted the Indians to be treated with respect so they would willingly come to Catholicism. Columbus did share this mindset though and wanted to convert the Indians and set friars to the New World to correct the men on the bad behaviors they were exhibiting. Since natives were said to be under the crown, they couldn't be made into slaves unless they were war captives or they violated natural law through practices such as cannibalism. This was done so as not to get in the way of conversions. Columbus fully believed in this and told Pedro Margaretti, whom he left in charge during his exploration of Cuba in 1494, the following: "The chief thing you must do is watching carefully over the Indians, and allow no ill or harm to be done to them, nor anything was taken from them against their will, but rather that they should be honored and kept in safety so they do not rebel." Columbus, though, couldn't grasp the laws of slavery and how the slaves must come from idol worshippers, and so he, the merchant being he is, he tried to sell Indians at a good price to help better the economy at the expense of the Christian visionary side of him. Contrary to popular belief, however, slaves were only a small portion of the native population in Hispaniola, with most just being required to provide labor for the colony like everyone else. Columbus, after being stripped of his responsibilities in the lands he discovered, he made sure to clarify he believed the Indians were the wealth of the island because they did the work that fed and helped Christians. The problem was how to utilize the natives in the most economically satisfactory way while treating the natives as the monarchy wanted them to be treated. He didn't have the encomienda, i.e. unlimited personal service of Indians in his time, but rather, as Las Casas said, he granted land rights with limited rights of labor from Indians by compelling them to do work. There's no evidence Columbus made anything but land grants. An encomienda wouldn't fit in with Columbus's Genesese trading model, and an encomienda had no precedent then. Indians were mostly put into work bands and not allowed to Spaniards individually. Casa, despite mentioning Columbus's abuse of slaves and the campaigns of 1494 to 1496, never blamed Columbus for the corrupt encomienda system. Columbus more or less just looked on in indifference as the sort of encomienda system came about naturally. The fraternization of natives by the colonists may be where the encomienda system came from, and later governors, Columbus included, merely just rubber stamped it. Columbus, as a colonial administrator, more or less was overwhelmed by problems that exceeded his power, so that he chose to be a passive force and only really imposed his will, like with slave trade, because he felt there was no other option available. In August of 1498, when he arrived back at the island, the rebellion had gotten worse, and that was partially his fault for the reinforcements he set in. Rebellions were caused over disappointment in the island and the rule that Columbus's brothers put in place. While Columbus did try to make things better, things got worse as Alonso de Hojeta in 1499 got a license to look for pearls that Columbus had reported, and he started killing people as he traced Columbus's route before landing in Hispaniola trying to overthrow Columbus. Columbus sent his man Roldan against him, who eventually bought off Alonso, and Columbus had to kill a man named Adrian de Mexica, who challenged his power. Columbus would have a spiritual experience in 1499, which made him try to take some control over the situation, which he admitted showed a failure of administration on his part. He defeated rebels and Indians in the process. The monarchy appointed both Juan de Fonseca and Francisco de Bobadilla to admiral and judicial roles to provide more counterweight to Columbus. Francisco didn't like Columbus as he thought Columbus had not done a good job and didn't like Columbus' Genesee background. When Columbus was arrested for crimes levied against him, he refused to have his shackles taken off of him because, of course, Columbus wouldn't. Columbus stressed his desire to help a crusade. He admitted in court that he abused his power and said that the natives were savages. Funny enough, however, temporary imprisonment wasn't much of a bad thing for men like him. It was more seen as an occupational hazard and was more of a slap on the wrist in his time. He retained his titles but still wasn't the type of guy who wanted the power assigned him, as he wanted to be an explorer. This so allowed men as qualified as him to share power with him. All his hardships would follow him and his personality in the years that followed in his final transatlantic voyage. In early 1500, when Columbus arrived home in chains from Hispaniola, he came under much of his reputation being ruined, from which he tried to recover alongside his goal for a crusade to Jerusalem. Columbus figured that to help conquer Jerusalem from the Muslims, he would help build his legacy, and he felt the Holy Spirit had destined this path for him. He felt that he had learned everything he had through personal experience and guidance by the Holy Spirit, which made him perfect to help take up the mantle. He argued that if the monarchs supported him, that would help extend their power, and that scripture and astrology from Pierre d'Ali said to do so was a good idea. Columbus, like many people of his day, believed that the end of the world was coming and that his discoveries were a sign of them to come. Columbus's religious experiences with God heightened whenever trouble brewed up in his life, such as when his life was threatened or he couldn't make friends with others. The years 1500 through 1501 featured Columbus gathering works of literature, whether they be from ancient pagans or the Bible, to confirm his views. He wanted to improve his standings with the monarchs. By early 1502, Columbus had been able to raise capital from Genesee's bakers so he could go to his discovered lands and to finish his explorations that were interrupted the last time. Gold production in Hispaniola had given him a little money. It was clear, though, due to the little fortune that had been amassed there so far by others who traveled, that would mean he'd have to travel farther west and north, which Columbus took to mean he could further his achievements. With the monarchy appointing Don Nicolas de Ovando in charge of Hispaniola government, Columbus could be more controlled, and so he traveled off to make a further voyage across the ocean sea. His promise to help relieve Genoa's taxation through his revenues won him much favor. Columbus on his voyage sought to extend Parra's coastal survey well to the north, which would allow the scouting for the route to Asia. Despite Columbus's excitement to reverse his fortune, the voyage would be a massive failure, with malaria, attacks by hostile Indians of the Panama coast, being abandoned in Jamaica, along with being massively underfed, all being his future problems. He scarcely got a good wind in his whole journey. In spite of being told not to break his journey in Hispaniola and disturb the governance there, Columbus still felt he had the duty to do so, as he wanted to see how Hispaniola was doing, seeing how attached he was to it. In Columbus's defense, however, he wasn't given much of a choice, seeing how Santo Domingo was the only permanent port on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean, which meant a stop in Hispaniola was sort of a requirement when a hurricane was coming. Ovando would angrily reject Columbus' shelter, from which Columbus began going on about his troubles. Many of Ovando's ships that brought him from Spain and carried treasure sunk in the midst of the hurricane. Due to the winds, Columbus would head west till July of 1502, when he came against the Belize coast, which was good for crossing the Atlantic and gave Columbus a second transnavigation through the Caribbean. Given the complex currents of the Caribbean, along with its other dangers and the fact Columbus had no native guides, made him believe that God had blessed him. He would, however, meet whom Columbus considered civilized natives while at the coast of Honduras, who gave him so much information of his journey. He'd sail against the wind in the direction of his former discovery due to the misleading information he got from the natives. Columbus thought that he was going through the Strait of Malacca, but his son said that his dad got this idea because he misunderstood the natives were talking about the Isthmus of Panama. 4 months went by and the men, including Columbus and his son, were sick, with Columbus coming close to death. In October of 1502, Columbus would reach a goal destination, i.e. the province of Veragua, in which he thought he had hit a major profit, although fever and many hardships struck before he could make said conquest possible. Veragua, while not being a total waste, wasn't much of a reward. The Guaymas Indians appeared nice and seemed willing to trade, but the harsh waters made it hard to get at much of the gold, and relations with said Indians became harsh over time. Columbus was essentially stuck with no home on shore and no way to escape by sea, as their ships were being eaten by termites. It is unsurprising in this sort of trauma Columbus turned to God and sort of committed treason against the monarchy in his speeches, as he claimed he got his divine authority from God, which was something only a king could say then. He very much considered himself a sort of Job character. Columbus claimed he wasn't getting the rewards he was promised by the monarchies. He later recovered and helped his men escape dangers, and by May of 1503, he had proved that the mainland is continuous from Honduras to Brazil, which was the last achievement of his. To keep from sinking in their boats, they had to use pumps and cooking pots to keep the water out. Their ships became unusable near the Jamaican coast. They survived on rodents and supplies they could trade with natives, and by intimidating the natives at the eclipse, he was able to get them to renew supplies. He had to deal with mutineers as well while trying to survive, and frequently spouted historical revisionist accounts of himself, saying that he had succeeded in search for a route of Asia. Once again, in his defense, given his danger and unknowingness of survival, one could forgive him in him trying to find some light at the end of the tunnel with all the troubles he had undergone. Governor Ovando refused to help Columbus and to give him a rescue for nearly 7 months, until Ovando sent an enemy of Columbus in the form of Diego de Escobar to see Columbus's condition. A rescue vessel came in June of 1504, and at that point Columbus and his crew had been left for almost a year. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye, and it was. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today we will be discussing the harsh time Columbus has seen in his time in Hispaniola and in his crossing. While Columbus was in Jamaica, Queen Isabella's health was in decline, as she grew more and more weak by the day, till she eventually died on November 26, 1504. Columbus was close to her and did mourn her death, and did wish the king well. Columbus began writing as if he wanted to be the governor of Hispaniola again, by writing plans for the colony, but as his own health began to decline, and he realized he already had the wealth he needed, that want faded. He'd have his kids handle his affairs in regard to the revenue he was promised for his trips. While Columbus worried that the king was being hostile and depriving his son of his inheritance, votes. It turned out the waiting game was standard practice at the time for petitioners, and compared to other people, Columbus's family was actually getting good treatment. He gave his son, Diego, a 50,000 maravedis a year pension, a good wife, and fulfilled Columbus's wish of having his son be governor of Hispaniola as he was. It was in terms of pensionary rewards that King Ferdinand was unwilling to give Columbus what Columbus believed he deserved, as the two disagreed on what was owed. In his last years, he wrote of the highlights of his life and people he loved and the things he accomplished. Very typical of a dying man. He died on May 20th, 1506, and even in death he didn't stop traveling, as his body has been repeatedly moved over the course of hundreds of years, with parts of him being lost in many spots. Columbus brought new lands across the Atlantic for people, and royals didn't fulfill their promises to him. People have repeatedly denied that he discovered the New World, when all evidence says he did. Martin Pinzon, whom people tried to credit for discovering America, joined the party later than Columbus. The discovery of America then was attributed to Amerigo Vespucci, although Columbus predated him by a year in the Gulf of Para, and Columbus's report was what inspired Amerigo to take the trip. However, Amerigo, due to his effectiveness as a publicist, got the name America over and it stuck. What's funny is that Amerigo's fame occurred late, only after Columbus's death, and Amerigo and Columbus were friends whom had respect for each other's work. Many of Columbus's rivals wanted to attribute the discovery to anyone but Columbus, and went into fantasies in saying people like the Welsh and Scots, amongst others, did it first. It is often pointed out how Leif Erikson made a settlement in the Americas 500 years before Columbus, even though these previous settlements really amounted to nothing. Columbus didn't initially set out to discover America, but rather to gain wealth so he could finance a crusade to help fellow Christians get back at Islamic domination. Columbus, contrary to popular opinion, didn't set out to enslave the American Indians and was ignorant of their existence. He just took advantage of the situation. Vikings could have reached America from their colonies, as it is possible they could have made it from their Greenland homes. However, Vikings really didn't do anything with their discovery, and it amounted to no cultural significance of the world. Their transatlantic route only linked America to Scandinavia in an indirect intermediate way, while Columbus's discovery discovered the easy direct route access and helped spread Western ideas across the world. Columbus discovered two routes with a transatlantic and Caribbean, which linked civilizations of Mediterranean and Mesoamerica, along with discovered the trade wind route, which helped open up the world to its successors. He was the first in a lasting transatlantic navigation tradition that has continued to influence us to this day, which makes him, in my book, the discoverer of America. One may argue, however, that one could speak of discovery when natives lived on the land for thousands of years, but this misunderstands how the term discovery is used. Discovery isn't a matter of just happening to be in the land, but pinpointing the land's location, how to get to it, and establishing routes for people to get there, which is something natives really didn't do. Outside of discovering America, Columbus also, as an explorer, decoded the Atlantic wind systems, demonstrated the continental nature of parts of South and Central America, helped map Atlantic and the New World, etc. Columbus knew he wasn't smart and used that fact to revel in correcting mistakes of the perceived wise ones of his day. While Columbus's religious beliefs were very important to him, he really didn't practice it much, as his charity work was mostly limited to events in his home, and he attended few religious banquets. Now, this is not, of course, to say that Columbus was by any means perfect. He disregarded Indians, was a drama queen with a persecution complex, couldn't keep friends due to his behaviors, and at times verged on insanity through his travels. He didn't embrace adversity and craved exploration to prove himself more than actual wealth and fame, although those of course helped. Columbus, by this, however, was very much saddened because he always longed for more than what he had had. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today is the last video on the Columbus. I'll be going over the heat Columbus gets in the media and its history. Now, Columbus has had his critics and appraisers since he was alive. Much of the appraise and critique Columbus got can be attributed to the way he carried himself in his hard-headed and emotional way. But mere critiques of him doesn't seem to be what people are going for, as they seem to be a lynch mob that want to discredit a long-since dead man. Conservatives and liberals on the left and right have for a while now butchered history on Columbus and his contributions. This new wave of anti-Columbus hatred can be traced to the scholar Howard Zinn, whom takes the blame for the decline in history writing. Historians on all sides of the political spectrum have sought to correct his history and offered a balanced view of America. Even the Marxist historian Eugene Genovese dismisses some of Zinn's work, calling it awful. A 2012 reader survey by the History News Network found the book to be a runner-up for the least credible history book, and this book is Zinn's book, and it's known as A People's History of the United States. And it is known for being very Marxist in its writing and of its appeal to America's atrocities. The rhetoric in the book is very radical and uses quotations to shock readers into getting people to become communists. To get back to Columbus, Howard Zinn is the one responsible really for the tale of Columbus as a genocidal monster. His ideas have spread to the educational system, which makes people want to abolish Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. Zinn largely borrowed material from the playwright Hans Koning's book, Columbus. Hans wasn't a historian and wasn't a scholar on Columbus. The books have taken Columbus out of context, such as with the "they would have made fine servants" line, which is typically meshed together with other entries from Columbus. Simply put, Columbus liked the Arawak's cultural unity, and the statement was to explain an earlier comment he made about others coming to the island to make them slaves. Columbus's first concern was to save their native souls. They don't do the wrecked Santa Maria fort story justice, as they attribute the killings of the 39 men left behind due to a lack of space on the return voyage as being killed because they were killing and raping the natives. It's unknown exactly why the men were killed, but the theory that they were killed because they were raping and killing Indians isn't quite true. It is suggested it could have been political, as more elite chief Indians had a problem with lower level chief Indians having a bunch of well-armed Europeans with them, and it's also possible that it was due to the natives' mythology. Spaniards were thought by the people to be mythical beings that consumed human flesh. A thing to remember about Bartholomew de la Casa is that he had a habit of being very bombastic, and his works are where a lot of negative criticism of Spain comes from. He could over-exaggerate things in his pursuit of helping improve native lives. As such, he tended to focus on the abuses that happened early on in the 1510s to 20s time frame, while ignoring the laws, peace treaties, and government action that came about in the 1530s. Zinn and others tell false tales of the Tano people and their deaths. It is unknown exactly how many Tanos died. Casa did criticize Columbus and said that he didn't do a good job with policies which led to the abuses, but overall said that the atrocities happened after the Columbus. Overall, as my other series all go into, this is all about showing how misinformation about history can become widespread and become a part of the culture. I hope my series has helped people come to a better understanding of Columbus and his life. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and give eyes.